amazing Australians and the story of their lives. You're tuned to Lots to Chat About with Rosemary Peterswald.
Hello and welcome, listeners. My guest today is author Jenny Old, a woman who I regard as a real pioneer in this vast country of ours. Back in 1969, Jenny, a trained nurse, left a comfortable life behind and went to the outback, and I mean the outback, some thousands of miles into the Gulf country in far north Queensland, and 24 hours by road, much of it dirt in those times, from Brisbane. She was following love. She and her husband Rick took a lump of virgin land in the middle of nowhere and turned it into a thriving cattle property. Jenny wrote a book about it called Back of Beyond, which is a terrific read. Welcome, Jenny.
Thank you, Rosemary. Thank you for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure. Tell us how you, a privately educated young woman and Victorian-trained nurse from Melbourne, and, well, you were in the Riverina area, but you did your training in Melbourne, happened to end up on this vast, barren property called McAllister with a man, in fact, you hardly knew.
You're so right. I fell in love with Rick 10 days before I was due to set off overseas for my dream, 12 months away. And that wasn't really appropriate, but he promised he'd be there when I returned, and I wondered. So off I set in tears and had my 12 months, and he was actually there to meet me 12 months later. But I wasn't quite the same girl that he said goodbye to.
I think that's hilarious because Jenny went off and, well, you had a year. And in fact, that's another book called Innocent Nurses Abroad. But you went off, I think, sort of quite slim tan, the Aussie girl, and you came back a typical English girl, didn't you? A little bit pudding and dressed in the latest English fashions.
I did. Oh, I'd put on about 12 kilograms while I was away, being wined and dined by a Scotsman. And a grateful patient had given me a gift voucher to Harrods, and I thought I'd spend it on a lovely outfit to wow this man. So we got to Hong Kong, and I went to the hairdresser, had the big beehive with lots of hairspray to get me home. And I'd bought a burgundy mini dress and the big clumpy patent leather shoes and dangly earrings, the whole thing. And when I walked through the door, I looked like an overripe plum, and his face just fell. And beside me was my beautiful friend Dee with long, shiny black hair and a slim fitting. She hadn't put on an ounce. And I could just see Rick thinking, I think I've backed the wrong horse here.
Oh.
So it was rocky for a while.
It certainly wasn't after a little while, as you say, then, because you spent a bit of time, I think, in Sydney, and everything sort of fell back into order. And then you knew he'd bought or went into shares, isn't it, in this property called McAllister, which was right up 450 miles, I think, from Normanton, isn't it? Or
67 kilometres from Normanton, from Mount Isa.
Oh, from Mount Isa, that's right.
Yes.
So he enticed you to go and join him there.
Yes.
And you did. You flew into Mount Isa, and Rick is actually sitting in there with Paul. I hope you'd explain fully why you were so late and left us standing at the airport.
I arrived at Mount Isa Airport so in anticipation of my man and this new adventure, because I'd been a bit bored after being in Europe for a year, so I was looking for adventure. Not a sign of him. And the cleaners came in, the tables went up in the coffee shop, and everybody disappeared. And I thought, what am I going to do? Anyway, luckily, as I was about to, if there'd been a return flight, I think I might have been on it, a puff of dust, and there he was. He's never quite explained why he was so late. Never. But anyway, there he was.
Waited.
And of course, I forgave him immediately.
Absolutely. And you drove back. Well, you forgave him immediately, but you must have been rather stunned when you actually arrived. You hopped in the four-wheel drive or whatever it was, Land Rover at that stage, and drove out to this property called McAllister, where there was rather a fright waiting for you, really.
We arrived in the dark, having driven for about 7 hours, and through gates and through the rockiest, most impossible road. And by the headlights, all I could see was this little iron shed, a machinery shed.
Yes.
And that was it. I really wasn't prepared. And it was dark, so we lit a few candles. And
it was quite romantic, probably, the first night.
No.
Oh.
I wondered
Until
what I'd
you woke up in the morning.
Dingoes were howling, and I just thought, but anyway, I did wake up the next morning, looked out at the view and thought, wow, this is beautiful. And I don't quite know where this love of this remote area came from. I guess both my grandparents were pioneers, but
In the Riverina area, yes.
in the Riverina, and my mother's parents were pioneers in the Blue Mountains. So I guess when I look back, that's where a bit of the pioneering spirit came from, but I'd never been challenged.
No.
I just had a very comfortable life, and then here I was. And then I was put on a horse and told to hold a mob of cattle, which I did for about 12 hours.
That was after you'd been given the fencing wire and whatever, and told to get on the horse and go out and help Rip do the fencing. But yes, as you say, I must admit, Rob and I built a house once on a farm and lived in a caravan and had the similar sort of thing of the dunny, the big hole being dug and the shower on the tree. But I think yours was much more remote than ours was. But Paul was there, wasn't he? Because I might explain to the listeners that you bought McAllister sort of with a syndicate from Papua New Guinea. Of which Rick and Paul were part of that syndicate. So for quite a while, Paul was there, wasn't he, and helped you build your house and set up the farm a bit. Yes,
it wasn't really an ideal situation for our parents. There up there with two young men living in a shed.
Absolutely.
But it just worked. He was wonderful.
Yes.
And Paul and Rick were the two working shareholders. The others had other stations and properties, and they were there to develop and build it. And I just became the third worker, and I did it, and I loved it. It was fun.
Did you ever think of leaving and thinking, I can't handle this?
I did one day fencing when it was so hot and I was falling down, and Rick kept disappearing in the distance in the Toyota, just leaving me a pile of tie wires.
Yes.
And I thought, what are you doing here? I'd sort of in my mind thought, I'm going off to apply to be a theatre sister at North Shore. That's what I wanted to do.
I'm not surprised.
Then by the end of the day and after 3 weeks, he proposed.
Oh, and so you stayed, and you've stayed ever since. Isn't that lovely? But now tell me, how many acres was it, or hectares, or whatever?
It was
McAllister?
234 square miles. So, but only a small station for up there. We were surrounded by great big stations of 1,000 square miles. So we were small, and we were a property taken off a bigger station.
Right.
So it was good country, but we were small by those standards.
I've been watching the series on television called Territory.
Yes.
Now, of course, the house there looks very posh and whatever. So I can't imagine it's anything like you arrived at. But the vastness of the country it's just almost impossible to take in how much land there is out there.
It was huge to me because the first paddock that I was helping to muster in, I asked Rick how big it was. He said it's about 80 square miles. I just freaked because my home property was only 2,000 acres. And I thought, this is just massive. So the vastness was quite amazing to me.
It was terrific that you could ride, and you had a favourite horse, little pony, wasn't it? A little foal, I should say, that you reared.
Did.
But you weren't accustomed to that sort of remoteness and that sort of hard country. But at least you were a country girl.
Yes, exactly, and I think that really helped. I love the bush, and I love the horses. I love the cattle, and I read about 8 little poddy foals, little Brumby foals that we found without their mother. And, I just love the country, the chooks, the garden and all of that. So that was lucky, I think, that I was from the country, even very differently.
When you first arrived, as you say, it was virtually just a shed that you lived in. How long was it before you actually... I know the house was a work in progress and the garden, which ended up being magnificent, was a work in progress. But how long was it before you actually had a house that you could live in? I think your parents came to visit when you were still living in the shed, didn't they?
Yes.
Or Rick's parents came to visit when you were living in the shed.
Rick's parents from North Shore, Sydney, yes. And she wore her high heels and wanted me to do her fingernails and her hair. But they were amazing. It was about 12 months before we moved in because I became pregnant on our honeymoon.
Oh, that's
Not
right.
ideal.
Yes.
No house, no money, no family, no running water, no electricity, no telephone, the whole thing. So I had the baby sort of 9 months later.
In Mount Isa, you went to have the baby, yes.
And then when I returned, we were still in the shed, but the house was we'd made the bricks and it was sort of it had the roof on it.
Yes.
So we moved in on our first wedding anniversary, even though it didn't have any facilities, but we moved in. But Rick had built this little 2-story log cabin for us to sleep in because I said we can't keep living with Paul in a shed as a married couple, especially being pregnant.
Exactly.
And so he built this little, called it the Gidgee hut, a 2-story log cabin for us to sleep in.
Right. Now, you say you made your own bricks, did you?
We made our own bricks and built the house slowly with Paul, bit by bit.
Yes. Paul, of course, eventually got married, didn't he?
He did.
And left.
Yes.
But that's a little bit later.
Yes.
Down the track. So, as you say, your parents came as well, didn't they, to visit?
Yes.
Well, they must have been a little bit like Mum when my mother came to Papua New Guinea in 90. Well, she was 66, but her eyes nearly popped out of her head. So I'm sure your mothers did much the same.
Yes, but Mum loved it. And I think, again, coming from pioneering stock in the Blue Mountains, I was really surprised. Dad didn't ever transplant terribly well. He'd start parking the car, heading for home after 10 days. But Mum loved it. She really threw herself into it. We were amazed. Both parents came up every year and visited.
Oh.
And they really loved it. But I think they were very pleased to go home to their home comforts as well.
I would imagine they would. I mean, the only communication you really had with the outside world was a two-way radio. Is that right?
Yes.
There was no TV, of course.
No.
There was the radio and Blue Hills and that sort of thing that you could listen to. But what amazed me most, Jenny, about this is that the amount of socialising that you were able to do with all the surrounding properties. Now, they'd come, obviously, they couldn't just pop in for dinner and then drive home at night. A lot of them stayed and came in caravans or tents or whatever. But it was a very close-knit community, wasn't it?
It was. I'm amazed how close-knit and how sociable it was. And as you say, people would come with their swags and stay the weekend, or we would do vice versa. But there was always a race meeting or a sports day or as many things as you could be involved with.
And you built a tennis court?
We did in the end, and we had wonderful tennis matches and tennis games. And the stockmen loved it too.
Yes.
So, we had lights on it, and we'd play nearly every night of the week.
Oh,
yeah, we really enjoyed that. So barbecues, tennis days, fundraising weekends. We became very involved with the Flying Doctor and School of the Air and Isolated Children's Parents Association. So there was always functions on, and we became very involved.
But you had to do all the cooking.
Oh, God.
And there was, as you say, there were dillaroos and jackaroos and drop-ins and visitors that just wanted to see what the outback was like, which is all lovely and whatever, except that you had to keep producing meals, didn't you?
I got so tired of cooking.
And on a very basic stove, I might add, at this stage.
To begin with. Yeah. Well, even so, I only had a basic gas stove. But I suppose most nights, an average of 12 people a night. And I made the bread, and I was teaching the children. So it was, morning teas, puddings, meals, and I just got so tired of it. But we met the most interesting people, our visitors, because I think when we first moved up there, our friends came to visit, and then they went back and told their friends, and then their friends told their friends, and most of them we didn't know. So I'd look up at the end of the day and see that Toyota was coming up the airstrip and, hi, we're friends of so-and-so. They said, well, you must call in. You mustn't see many people out here. Yeah. I go, oh.
What am I going to feed them? And as you say, the letter saying they were coming, of course, would arrive after you waved them off down the roadway to go on to the next place. You had some young French people who came to stay and just loved it, didn't they? I mean, it is. That's a unique, absolute unique experience. Now, you're listening to Lots to Chat About. My name is Rosemary Peterswald, and of course my guest today is Jenny Old, author and outback pioneer. As we've said, the only communication, of course, you had was two-way radio, but you made your own fun, as you say, like tennis and whatever. But poker, which I must admit we used to play in New Guinea, which, even though it was illegal, was great fun. But you had a lot of good poker nights, and I think some people left a little bit worse off than when they came.
We did. We had a lot of poker nights, sometimes till 4 o'clock in the morning. It was fun. And one night in Cloncurry, we had poker night. And, of course, it was legal too. And the police came in and... we were, we had matchsticks out, but then we would pay at the end of the day. But one of my dear friends was going, you owe me $2, $3. We go, shush. So he pulled us all outside. But luckily there was a bit of a ruckus down the street and they were pulled away. So we all just disappeared. But two of them were in the cold room, hiding.
Right.
With one of my friends. And he said, he stutters, Rowan stutters. He said to Dee, if they could come in, we've to stop taking. Oh. So we left them to freeze. We thought they deserved to be in there and cold, but we escaped.
Oh, terrific. You then eventually, and I presume Rick must have gone and got an aeroplane, a pilot's license. You did eventually get an aeroplane. Now that would have made life quite a bit easier.
Oh, it made such a difference. Yeah. And at this stage, we'd become the sole owners of McAllister. through a series of in the beef crash, and the interest rates went to 23% and we'd borrowed at 6%. So the banks were looking at closing on our partners who all had other property. So they elected to give us the debt, and which was massive, and then we could have it in our own right. So it's a big risk, but within 6 months we were able to turn that around, repay Rick's father who'd paid the interest, the outstanding interest, repay him. It was just a lucky turn of events. So we then had it on our own. So we were able to do improvements and things without, checking with other shareholders. The plane was a big thing. It made such a difference, an hour and a quarter to Mount Isa compared to 6 hours driving. And just to be able to check the waters for the cattle, half an hour just flying around. If there was a problem, you're onto it straight away. Made a huge difference.
Right. Yes, it would. Absolutely. Yes. And for socialising
yes.
and whatever. But particularly then when you went on to have another son,
yes.
You have Anthony, and then you had Ben after a few years. I think it, as you said, it was a little bit of a struggle there for a while. And then Ben arrived. So it made your world even busier, didn't it? I mean, you did have nannies, I suppose, not nannies, teachers that came in to help you, but sometimes they were more trouble than they were worth, weren't they?
Yes, they could be. But when I had Ben, we were starting to build the Birkenwells Roadhouse, and driving to Mount Isa, Rick always said, at this turn-off, I'm going to build a roadhouse there one day, because we had to carry fuel. Everyone did. It was a long stay. And, of course, when Rick says he's going to do something like that, he did, with partners, with two partners. So after I had Ben, we moved to the site of the Birkenwells and lived in a caravan in the wet season, and you'd appreciate that, from New Guinea, for 6 months while the beginnings of the roadhouse were built. So that was the beginning of Ben's life.
Right.
In a caravan with Anthony, who was starting School of the Air and Correspondence, and a newborn.
Absolutely mind-boggling. And then, of course, you built the Birkenwells, which is, sadly it burnt down, but you rebuilt it, and it is very much there today, isn't it? I think a lot of people use it because, as you say, it's in the crossroads, isn't it? Right
it's
there.
A thriving community now. They have the Australian Championships of different stock events, and it's a really thriving community. It's wonderful to see that our vision was there and it's thriving.
Is there accommodation there as well, or is it? Yes.
Yes, they've got dongers, lots of dongers, and a little caravan park.
Right, right. But what a welcome sight for people that have been driving mile after mile after mile. And then to
it is, and all those trees we planted in the garden, that the owners there now are really doing a good job. It's a real oasis.
I hope there's a little plaque up there, is there, to Rick and Jenny Old, who built this? No.
No. Well,
have you been back since?
Yes, we have several times, and they actually sell a lot of my books, about 500 a year.
Oh, really?
And they just put them on a table, and there's a little plaque saying one of the original owners wrote this book, and they sell them for $32.50.
Oh.
And a retail price is $25. I mean,
right. Well, what a great outlet.
Yes. They really, I think all the grey nomads, but I'm still amazed they pay that price for it.
It's well, people like to know, as you say, how the place was built, and
local.
Who built it, and more about the history. Who lives at McAllister now? Do you know?
It's been sold to Stanbroke Pastoral Company, so it's an outstation.
Yes.
So they have a head stockman living there, and we went through a couple of years ago, and there's a public road right past the house through McAllister. So we drove through, and we were absolutely in the right mindset that nothing will be the same, and we just wanted to go through. The house was barely recognisable. There's not a tree. It was just lawn, no trees.
Because you made such a beautiful garden.
It was an oasis, massive, really established trees. I don't know why they must have bulldozed the trees down. I don't understand. And a lot of the buildings had been moved.
Right.
But the cattle and the fencing, everything looked, really in great order. So
it's totally cattle country, isn't it? No sheep.
Yeah, Brahman cattle, the grey Brahmins.
Yes, because they always say you should never go back.
I know.
It's hard, isn't it?
Well, we went back with the right mindset.
Yes.
We knew it wouldn't be the same. We knew it was an outstation, and they've built this. Well, it's just a prefab house after our little gorgeous, interesting house and gidgee hut. So it was different, but it didn't really worry us. We went and sat up on our favourite jump up and looked out, and we felt comfortable with it.
When I read your book, I had a great feeling of nostalgia to a life that, well, I suppose we all knew back then. It did seem a little bit more simple. I mean,
Yes.
obviously very, very hard for you in that situation, and for Rick. I mean, Rick obviously worked incredibly hard,
He did.
as Paul did.
Yes.
But there was something sort of nostalgic that I felt very much when reading your book. And I must admit, I've sent it to my sister Jill, or she's downloaded it on Kindle down in Kiama, and she just loves it, absolutely. And she said to tell you so. And I think there's something that sort of pulls at people's strings, their heart, that it was a time gone by. But
I'm glad you felt that, because I just look at it as being probably the happiest, most rewarding time of my life, and challenging. But I loved it. I loved the people. Business was done on a handshake. People were there generous. If you had fires, they were there to help. And our most wonderful lifelong friends from there, and still are, of course.
Are any of the originals still there?
Not as many. Most of our close ones, Chris and Don McDonald, they still are on their stations up there.
Right.
And we've been back to visit them several times too, of course. But most of them have retired or moved to the coast.
Now, the boys, of course, all children tend to grow. And although school was terrific for the first number of years of their life, eventually they had to go away to boarding school. And I think that really broke your heart. Was that sort of the beginning of when you thought that you might sell up and leave?
Absolutely, yes. For me, I think timing too, it did break our hearts just saying goodbye to those little boys at Mount Isa Airport. And because I had taught them most of the time, I knew their weaknesses, their strengths, and then suddenly we'd just get a little report saying, he could do better, or and no telephone, so we had no communication other than this little letter that would arrive once a week. Hi, Mum and Dad, how are you? We are well. I am well. The movie this week was. That's all I ever got.
That's all you get from boys anyway.
Exactly. So that was tough. And Rick had run out of challenge. We had developed the property totally. It was
Paul, of course, as I say, had married and left at this stage.
Gone, yes. So it was ours alone. And we either had to get bigger, because we had 5,000 head of cattle. And up there, to maintain a stock camp for 12 months a year, you really needed 10,000 head. Yes. Because try and have the continuity of staff. The ringers don't like to go fencing. They're cattle people. Yes. So we either had to get bigger or move, and the pull to be near the boys.
Who were in Toowoomba at that stage.
They were in Toowoomba.
Yes.
But it was a really hard departure. Rick he's a people's person. He's an outgoing person. He was, I think, looking forward to the next adventure. I didn't transplant terribly well.
What was the next adventure?
Down to Toowoomba, and then we bought a steel-framed home franchise, which we learnt very quickly you can't do business on a handshake. Not that we did, but people would undercut you, and it was just a cutthroat business. It wasn't very kind to us.
But driving down that last time down the driveway from McAllister, and I might add that Jenny's book was originally called McAllister when she first published it, but then she was very lucky, all readers are lucky, I should say, that it was taken on by a large publisher. And then, of course, it was called Back of Beyond, which I think probably describes more to the reader as to what it was.
Yes, I think so. No, we were very lucky because they took it on board. I sent down the manuscript, and I had a phone call. I sent it down on Friday, and the publisher rang me on Monday, and she said, "How much advance do you want?"
Oh, really?
I was driving to pick up the grandchildren. I just pulled over and went, "What do you mean?"
Yes, and she didn't mind that you'd already published it yourself first?
No, I think it was a great plus because I had sold 2,000 books in 12 months, and I had a big following, of course, on social media. Yes. And that was a big plus for them. Yes. The first thing they look at is because I'm not great on social media, but I had to be.
Exactly. In fact, I had Fiona Stager from the bookshops here in Brisbane, and Annie Seaton, who's an incredible author as well. And as she, or as they say, and Selva Anthony, who is my agent, unfortunately publishers these days, even more so, Jenny, in the last couple of years, the first thing they ask you is how many followers have you got on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram and whatever. Yes. So it is...
it's a different world, isn't it?
It is, yes, absolutely. Yeah. We talked vaguely about your first book. I couldn't quite work. Did you write the first book first, or did you write this one first, and then you did the...
then I did the second one.
Innocent Nurses Abroad.
They were just two periods of my life I wanted to record, and it was a bit of fun, and I thought that one's probably more just for family and my
Yes.
nursing friends. It's not such a blockbuster as Back of Beyond.
Yes.
And I independently published that with Ocean Reef Publishing.
Right.
And I was due to do a big, I like doing fundraising events. I do a lot of author talks
Yes.
and publishing talks, but it was due to be launched in Mount Gambier
Right.
with 200 people for a cancer fundraising event. And then COVID hit.
Oh, of course.
So that
yes.
was published right when COVID hit. And of
Yes.
course, the books couldn't be delivered on time. And then that was cancelled. And then we were in a caravan about to go around Australia. So we thought Anastasia's going to close the borders. So we
Yes.
headed for home. And that was a bit chaotic.
But for readers out there that have actually read Back of Beyond or want to read Back of Beyond, it is actually a terrific book to read, Innocent Nurses
you.
Abroad, because it gives you a little bit of the story before.
Exactly.
And it makes me realise, Rick, how lucky you were that she came back.
Isn't he lucky?
That's right.
I keep reminding him.
Exactly, that's right. Yes. But what's sort of in store for Jenny and Rick McAllister at the moment? I think you said that you have moved down the Gold Coast and
Yes.
and enjoying life by the sea, is it right?
Yes.
A totally different life.
Totally. When people say you've come from there to the Gold Coast, never thought I would have ended up at the Gold Coast. But
Yeah.
we have a son and two children, his two children here, and we love the Gold Coast. I love the eclectic people we've met. All our friends are basically country people, and they're still
Yes.
our friends, of course, and they're still special. But I've been doing Italian lessons for about 12 years, and I've got a very small, close-knit group.
Right.
And meeting people with different political views, different
Yeah.
backgrounds has been really stimulating, and we're really enjoying it.
Oh, that's
Yes,
lovely.
yeah.
And well, as you say, you've got one son close there and another one up further north. But I mean, I know Rick was brought up in Sydney and
Yes.
totally sort of different to a life on the land, but always wanted to go on the land and
Yes.
obviously did. Did either of your boys feel that, or they thought, no, enough of that? I don't think that's for me.
Well, at the time too, we before we sold, we sat them down and said, look, this is what we're thinking. What are you thinking? And Anthony always wanted to be a builder from this whole.
Yes.
And Ben was one that if I'd say, do you want to come and check the waters with me? He'd say, oh, not if I have to get out and open the gates.
Oh,
He
right,
was
yeah.
very much an IT boy, much as they loved being there. So they were quite happy to move at the time. But in retrospect, Anthony would have loved to have gone back.
Right.
And he has a number 4, his son, who's called McAllister.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And he is not a student. And I said to Anthony, you deserve this child. You so deserve this child. So none of the grandchildren would have really gone back.
Yeah.
And it is a young person's world,
It
really. So they have gone on to have their own careers. Anthony did go on to be a builder, and he's now a bit of an entrepreneur, like his father, with entrepreneurial ideas.
Yes.
And Ben has got Zarafa's coffee shop, so he's always been an entrepreneur too. So they've gone on to do their own thing, but they look back on their childhood as being very special.
They had a very good grounding, and as you said, it was a lovely life for children
It
because they
was.
befriended the jackaroos and the jillaroos, and some better than others, obviously.
Yes.
So some had a few little habits that
Yes.
made it difficult for them in the way of I suppose.
Yes.
A lot of people escaped to the country
Absolutely.
if they liked the drink, etc.
Exactly.
And whatever. So you had to keep an eye out. But it was a terrific grounding for the children.
And for them to learn to take people at face value
Yes.
and never prejudge. I mean, they had friends, Aboriginals,
Yeah.
through to big station owners, and they've been good people because they've got a variety of friends and they never prejudge people. And I'm proud of that. No, they had a wonderful childhood.
Wonderful.
Yes.
Sounds as though absolutely ideal. And no matter what difficulties parents are going through and whatever, children seem to thrive.
They do. They do.
Particularly if they've got acres and acres or hectares and
Motorbikes
or miles
and horses
and miles.
and dogs and pet kangaroos and pet dogs, and they had everything. It was a wonderful childhood.
Exactly.
They were lucky.
Gosh, we could go on chatting for hours, but sadly it is time that I need to say thank you very much, Jenny Old and Rick, who is sitting in there with Paul, for sharing your story with us today, which is absolutely fascinating. Now, if you wanted to get Jenny's book, she's got at www.jennyold.com. If you go onto her website, you can order either her book, which is called Back of Beyond, or Innocent Nurses Abroad. So, Jenna, thank you very, very much for being my guest today. And
Thank
Rick,
you.
and thank you, Paul, for producing.
Thank you, Rosemary.
Great friends and great chats. That was another Lots to Chat About with Rosemary Peterswald. Stay tuned next week for another amazing chat.